All right. All righty, here we go. So I'm sorry that the bulb on the projector is so bad. I wish you could see it better, but anyway, that's the way the ball bounces. We're going to go ahead and start our discussion now, and the way this works is I'm going to walk around to the groups and I'm going to stick a microphone in your face, and you're going to do the best you can, all right? Now, I hope you thought as you were reading this piece, you know, why the hell did he have us read this one first, right? There's a lot of reasons, but one reason is because I like it because it immediately makes you confront the fact. Remember I said we were going to be interested in facts? The fact that history is politicized. Frankly, it's not always true. And so discovering what's true is important, right? Okay? And of course, he does that in very interesting ways in which only he can. So just before we actually go to the discussion, let me just show you, I drew something on the board. The thing is called We Were 8 Years in Power. That's the name of the book that this comes from. It has 8 of his essays in it. And before each of his essay, it has an introductory 8 or 10 pages in which he kind of talks about, you know, the issue that he's going to bring up. The book's selling like gangbusters anyway. But it's entitled We Were 8 Years in Power, which makes you think that he was actually talking about the 8 years that Obama was in power. But that's not the 8 years he's talking about. He's talking about the 8 years that blacks were in power in the South after the Civil War, the period of Reconstruction. We were 8 years in power, he said. And don't forget, you should already know this from your work in this class, don't forget that Reconstruction comes to an end in 1876, roughly. Jim Crow and segregation is imposed, I should say, on the South. Remember, during slavery, there wasn't segregation. Blacks and whites lived this close to one another. But once slaves are set free, and now they're citizens, and they can do what they want, you have to control them in other ways. So, as you'll see in a few readings, you might use the penal system. You'll use the political system. You'll create Jim Crow, you'll create segregation. This is how you control people who you used to be able to whip and beat and sell. But you can't do that anymore, theoretically. Although, as Jim Crow is reimposed, don't forget that about 5,000 lynchings would take place in the South. 5,000 lynchings over the course of about 60 years. That's not an inconsiderable number of murders. Okay? Which brings us then to around the 1940s and 50s, the emergence of the civil rights movement, you know, the Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King Jr., Southern Christian Leadership Council, all of that kind of stuff, gets us to the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, which of course brings us to the high water mark of that, 1964, 1965, the creation of the Voting Rights Act, the creation of the Civil Rights Act, and that was 50 years ago. But notice that for 100 years, well, at least for 100 years, white supremacy was simply reimposed. And then, of course, in the last 50 years, it's been different. But finally, 2009, 2008, America elects a black man, who, by the way, is also a white man. Right? So that's where we start the story, and that's where we're going to start these questions, all right? And hopefully my camera will make it. I should have charged it. But anyway. All right, here we go. I'm going to start with you. Question number 1. Let me see if I can get this thing to work. All right, in Coates telling, how central, so you need an adjective here, how central was the brand of white supremacy to the country even in 2008? So this really is about how central was the brand of white supremacy throughout all this history, but in his argument, how central?
I put extremely central because even though the president is the president, he wasn't protected from racial discrimination.
You're talking about President Obama?
Yes.
Okay.
The White House was depicted with watermelons. He was called the food stamp president. So people were still making fun of him even though he was in charge of the country.
Okay. So certainly you're saying that Coates is saying that even in 2008, white supremacy was still absolutely central, or extremely central, I think you said, but central nonetheless. I mean, central means it's right there in the center, right?
Yes.
Not on the periphery. It's right in the center, okay?
Yes.
But he's not just talking about 2008, is he?
No.
All right, so add to that if you can.
I don't.
Okay, fair enough. Add to that if you can. How central was the brand of white supremacy to this whole story? All right, pretty good.
Well, just the similarities between the 8 years President Obama was in office and the 8 years where slavery wasn't a thing anymore. That's pretty. Yeah. That's
Okay.
All I got.
All right. How central was white supremacy to this story?
It was really central simply because it always, since then and here, and from 2017, it has always been, like white supremacy. Even with the case, like with Henry Louis Gates, when they accused him of breaking into his own home, they called the cops, and then Obama had to invite him over for the beer, him and the police officer.
Okay.
So it's always been, white supremacy.
Okay. All right. You, sir? Same question?
Yeah, I feel like it was really central. So, I mean, it's not as obvious the way they show it, but, I mean, it's still there.
Wait a minute. You said it's not as obvious the way they show it. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, like, obviously back in the day when there was, like, lots of racism, they would just, lynch people, kill people. Nowadays, you can't really do that. So they just...
Whoa. Wait a minute. I don't know how many times it's happened, but, United States policemen can shoot black people and not lose their jobs, not be arrested, not be put in jail, right? Michael Brown did lay in the street in Ferguson for 4 hours before they covered his body, right? Eric Garner was choked to death. You want to revise that?
Yeah, that's all very true. So basically what I'm trying to say is that, I mean, there is some people that show it that way still, but it's not really shown that way.
Okay, so let me. That's good. That's fine. You guys are doing fine, by the way. Let me say something. What we're doing right now is we are not articulating our opinion, except that we are articulating our opinion of what Coates means. What we're really trying to do is express what Coates has to say. This is an important exercise for you, whether you like Coates or not. You have to be able to unpack and understand sophisticated arguments, whether you agree with them or not. And so what we're interested in here is not so much what I'm saying, but what Coates is saying. Okay? We want to get to what Coates is trying to say. All right? So I'm going to mosey on over here, and I'm going to ask you to just take this question again to how central, according to Coates, was white supremacy to all of this?
So for this one, what I wrote is it was very central in the sense that the country went through a pattern of empowering African Americans only to then turn around and take back this power from them. Plus, our versions of history omit some painful truths about the poor treatment of African Americans. So Obama's election as president was part of this familiar cycle.
Okay. All right. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and uncover this, and I'm going to show you guys some quotes. By the way, I don't normally do these PowerPoints for discussions, but I happen to do this one. Okay. It won't always be this way, but today I did. So let me just go ahead and kind of jump in here. I say absolutely central, and by that I mean you couldn't take white supremacy out of the equation and still have America. That's what I think Coates is saying. I say absolutely central and always has been to the tribe of white supremacy. This is the way he refers to white supremacists. Notice that he refers to them as the tribe of white supremacy. Maybe you guys have heard this term tribalism to describe our politics. You've heard identity politics. You've probably heard, people on the right accuse the left of identity politics because, for instance, today we can't open the government because the Democrats are insisting on trying to help the dreamers, right? It's identity politics, right? But don't forget that President Trump and his people engaged in identity politics too. And the alt-right and all of the kind of dialogue that we have, that's all identity politics, right? So it's not just the left that's engaging in, shall we say, tribalism, okay? He goes on to say, we forgot that there were those who loved that old country as it was, who did not lament the divisions but drew power from them. That quote comes from that section where he was talking about the election of President Barack Obama. And, in particular, how it was followed by the election of Trump, Donald Trump. And he says, we forgot that there's a lot of people in this country who loved, look at this, that old country. Who loved that white, racist, discriminatory country. Right? That white supremacist country. We forgot because they elected a black man, we forgot that that stuff might still be there, right? Now, he says, at the outbreak of the Civil War, notice, the forces of Union thought white supremacy was still affordable. Think about this for a minute. The forces of Union thought white supremacy was still affordable, so in the North even, abolition was denounced. I say the Civil War was not initially about abolition. It wasn't about slavery from the perspective of the Northerners, although he makes the argument that it was about slavery from the perspective of the Southerners. Notice that he's saying that white Southerners like Alexander Stephens and Jefferson Davis fought that war to preserve slavery, to preserve white supremacy, to preserve their own, notice, superiority. Whereas people in the North did not fight the war to do away with slavery. They fought it as a war of union. It's not until 1863, the adoption of the Emancipation Proclamation, that the Civil War becomes about abolition, right? It's only late in the process, right? And of course, at the beginning of the war, blacks couldn't fight. But read this. But as deaths and years mounted, I love this phrase, wallowing in white supremacy amidst the increase of dead was like wallowing in pearls amidst a famine. That's great writing, by the way. Emancipation was embraced. Blacks were recruited and sent into battle, where they killed white people to gain their freedom. Stop. Hard stop. You know, one of the problems about the Civil War is that black people killed white people during their freedom. Thousands of them. Thousands of them. At least if you look at the true story. Then, after 1876, the country returned to its white supremacist roots, and would, to one degree or another, remain that way. By the way, the North, this is Coates' argument, the North returned to its white supremacist roots as well. Okay? All right. Any questions or comments on that stuff? Does that make sense? How central was it? Coates is saying you can't tell the truth. You can't tell the truth about the Civil War. He's saying you can't tell the truth about America without dealing with white supremacy. So let me answer the question. Why was the South allowed to reimpose this dehumanizing, horrible system of white supremacy where thousands of people were raped and lynched over the course of 80 years after, notice this, we were 8 years in power, he said. Now, I'll tell you what you were taught in high school. You were taught in high school that the South did that. That's not what Coates is saying. Coates is saying the North did it. Coates is saying the entire country is implicated in it. In fact, he's saying American democracy itself is a production of white supremacy. Okay, I get that I ain't messing around here. I get that I'm asking for it. I'm asking to get hit in the mouth here, right? Right out of the gate, I'm having you do a reading that says America is fundamentally, is centrally white supremacist. The question is that true? Right? Well, we've got a long time to figure that out, but that's the argument that he's making. All right, to you guys. How important is true, accurate history, and what must true history confront?
Okay. I think true and accurate history is important because if you tell fake history repeated, or if you tell fake history, it's more likely to be repeated. Telling the truth is important for history to not repeat.
Not repeat itself?
Not repeat itself. And but I think that true history must confront the facts, not just some facts, but all the facts. If you want some.
Wait a minute. You think that true history must confront the facts? It seems to me that true history would be the facts.
Oh yeah, I kind of. Yeah.
That's all right.
I see what you're saying.
You're doing fine.
Okay.
So what do you think about that? You want to edit that?
A little bit.
Yeah. What do you want to say then? If true history is the fact or the facts, whatever that is, by the way. I mean, we can argue about what is and isn't true history. But if true history is the facts and a proper interpretation of the facts, why is true history important? What does it need to confront? Lies. Or
true history should, like she said, highlight all the events, like...
in order to contradict what? And don't say lies. Something much more big and important. Starts with an M.
To contradict...
Starts with an M, second letter is Y.
Myths.
Myth. Myth. Stop for a minute. Think about this. Is Coates not saying, is he not saying that the common theory of the Civil War and its history, is he not saying it's a myth?
The original, I guess, in high school when you learn about it, when it's just, you're first exposed to the Civil War, it's a war to end slavery. That's our first exposure to what the Civil War was. And, I think when he says exposing the myth, that ultimately that's not what the Civil War was for. There was a lot of financial ties that people had to owning slaves, and there was a big market that the North didn't have, that the South did have, because of slavery.
Okay, all right. So generally speaking, you do agree with this notion that the reason we need true history is to dispel myths.
Yeah.
Okay. But what's the role of myths in history? Why do we need myths?
I mean, part of it, too, I feel like, because you're teaching younger kids, I feel like part of it is you're not going to tell kids right off the bat,
You're not going to tell them the truth?
Yeah.
The truth is too painful?
Arguably, yeah, depending on how you...
So we'll just lie to our children? In the schools?
I think it's a way of taking a different perspective on it, and that, isn't necessarily a lie, because like you said, it did become about, people wanting to keep their slaves.
Wait a minute, you said it's not necessarily a lie?
I think, like I said, it's taking a different perspective on it because there's a bunch of different perspectives.
To do what, though? Why take a different perspective? I'm having fun. I hope you are. You're doing fine.
Yeah. I mean, to kind of shield.
Shield who? Shield the kids?
just the inhumanity of it, I suppose.
I think you're letting some people off the hook. Why do we need myths? Why do we teach our children lies in the school according to Coates? Who's getting off the hook here?
To make people feel comfortable.
What people?
America.
Well, okay, be more precise.
Well, it's to make people feel comfortable because history, what it has to confront is the painful truths that come with it.
Okay.
So that's why the myth doesn't contain those painful truths because it wants to make people feel comfortable rather than saying that America wasn't just the Civil War ended slavery.
Okay. So there is someone to blame.
Yes.
There is someone to blame, and they are blameworthy, and they should be blamed. So the people we're letting off the hook aren't our children. It's the people who still, and whose ancestors were essentially white supremacists. The reason we don't tell our children isn't for our children's sake. Frankly, it's for our parents' sake. If I was teaching this in 10th grade at Clovis North, what the hell do you think would happen to me? I'm serious. I'd be fired. I'd be called before the board. I'd be done. Why? Not because it's not the truth, but because the parents of those children couldn't stand it. Because they would rise up and say, sorry, you don't get to say this. It's not true. Well, according to Coates, he would say, well, according to them, it's not true. Why? Because they've bought into this national myth that the Civil War wasn't what it was. Right? So why do we need true history? We need it to dispel, well, lies and myths. The problem is you start dispelling lies and myths and people get pissed off. For good reason. Because Coates is saying this is a white supremacist country, period. Now, you may disagree with that, but you must acknowledge that he is a very courageous man, this guy. All right? So, let's uncover this here. Notice, I have some quotes here. The accurate history of the Civil War breaks the myth. And so the history is ignored. And fictions are weaved into our art and politics that dress, notice this, that dress villainy in martyrdom. What do? We take villains and we turn them into martyrs. That's what our lies do, according to Coates, right? We transform banditry into chivalry. We take criminals and we turn them into, well, men who are chivalrous. And they fight and they die for their brothers, right? And that's a good thing, Woodrow Wilson said in whenever at that anniversary celebration. That's a good thing. The problem is it wasn't the truth. They fought and died to maintain slavery. They fought and they died to maintain white supremacy. And oh, by the way, after they got their asses kicked, and after 8 years and they finally got back in power, what did they do? They simply reimposed it. I understand why people don't want to sit through this stuff. I understand why some students just turn tail and run. They get it. Because stuff like this says, no, what you've taught isn't true. And the implications of what you've taught is destructive. And furthermore, he would say it turns people like me, not me, him, black people, into a problem. So let me address something real quick. It must be weird to be a person of color in my classes because I just will not stop talking about this stuff. You must feel objectified sometimes. Frankly, you must feel like a problem sometimes. But let me just say something. If you are a Latino in this country, it makes sense to me that you might feel like you're a problem. And if you are an African American in this country, it makes sense to me that you might feel like you're a problem. And all people like you are. And if you're Asian, for other reasons, you might think you're a problem. Although, interestingly, not as big a problem right now. But in the past, you've been a huge problem. And what Coates is saying is, listen, we're a problem. We are a problem to this society. And notice this, we've been one since 1619, the first time we stepped off the boat. And the answer has always been to subjugate us, to keep us down. Right? That's what he's saying. And now the lies of the Civil War and the lies of these post-racial years began to resonate in me. And I could now see history, awful and undead, reaching out from the grave. America had a biography, and in that biography, the shackling of black people, slaves and free, featured prominently. True history is a biography. The biography of this country. And when we look into it, we see that the Civil War was not a violent misunderstanding. President Trump said if Andrew Jackson would have been around at the time, he would have reached a compromise. And the Civil War wouldn't have happened. Are you kidding me? Andrew Jackson? The racist Indian killer? Right? The Civil War was not a violent misunderstanding, an honorable duel between wayward brothers. It was instead the outgrowth of a long war that was declared when the first Africans were brought chained to American shores. We actually would like to redeem ourselves from the Civil War, to reconcile at least whites with whites, so we embrace a myth instead of the truth. All of our popular understandings are in defiance of its painful truths. There is a need for palliative and painkillers. Palliatives and painkillers. So to get back to your very astute comments, what he's saying is, we embrace myth so that white people can get along.
White people and white supremacy. Also, just as America, we have been the land of opportunity, the land of freedom, the land of, all these good things, and to have a history that oppresses people, that, has human slavery, Jim Crow laws and stuff like that, really contradicts with ideals. So I feel like I said, if you want to take it outside of a racial perspective, everybody to a general point doesn't want to say that, this place where I'm from is supposed to be good and great, but has a history that in order to get to that point or leading up to that point has all this negative stuff attached to it.
Right.
I mean,
right.
Right.
So why do blacks not study the Civil War, according to him? Because the Civil War that is out there is not their war. It's not their truth. It's not their experience. It wasn't their experience, right? Why do they not study the Civil War? Literally, because they can't stomach it, right? Well, we're going to have to stomach this stuff, at least for 15 weeks, okay? It's not always going to be this intense, by the way. It's going to be less intense. And I'm sorry we didn't get through all the questions. But I will put this up on Blackboard so that you can see what else I put up on the PowerPoint, and it might be useful. But we're not leaving this stuff, okay? Very good work, by the way. Okay, we'll see you on Wednesday.
I don't know if you already covered this, but for the readings, for the books, can we put those in?